it meets the ocean. Sandy is like the beach, right? So rocky intertidal, we're going to talk about first. Okay, and here's just a few pictures of what it looks like. Okay, so if you ever go to the rocky intertidal zone, you may notice that there are actually like bands in the rocky intertidal zone. Bless you. And the bands are formed from animals. They're formed from animals. So different amounts or different types of animals can withstand different amounts of air exposure. So they will be found in certain areas of the intertidal, and those animals tend to have a certain color. So you get like these bands of color in the intertidal zone because of the animals and the color that they are. There's 5 zones. Okay, you have the splash zone, the upper, middle, lower intertidal, and then the subtidal. Your book will use like these terms: the supralittoral fringe, upper mid-littoral. Okay, and like these terms, they're super confusing. Okay, like I don't even know all these terms specifically, so I use these terms. These are all you need to know. Okay, because it's like upper mid-littoral. What? Like okay, middle and low mid-littoral. Huh? Like, okay, whatever. So splash, upper, middle, low, subtidal. Yeah. Whoa. So this upper zone is called the splash zone. And the splash zone is very, very rarely going to ever be underwater. This would be the zone that is only covered by the highest of the high tides. So most every other day, it will be exposed to the air. And it's called the splash zone because the majority of the water that this area gets is from when the waves crash and it sprays. That's how the animals get their water. Okay, so it's very, very rare that it's actually ever underwater. Types of animals that you find in this area, okay, are going to be these little snails, okay, and pteramorpha. That's actually that green algae that's in the picture, okay. And then you also get these small brownish gray barnacles, bless you, okay, that live up here as well. So they're like the little ones. They're the ones. And then lichen. Do you guys remember what lichen are from like freshman bio or 8th grade science, sort of? It's a mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae. Remember that? So it's a fungus and an algae living together. And so lichen are found up here in the stone. So that's up here. Okay, that's the splash zone. Highest zone. The high intertidal zone. Okay, this is going to be the zone that is exposed during each low tide. Okay, so this is going to be this upper part right here. Okay, and so every low tide, that's going to get exposed to the air. And it's going to be the last thing to be covered. Okay. Types of things that you find here are acorn barnacles. That's this picture right here. Shore crabs. Okay, limpets. Okay, that sort of thing. That's this zone right here. Okay. Okay. Barnacles. Lots of barnacles. The middle intertidal zone. So the middle intertidal zone is only exposed to the air for part of each low tide. Okay, it's exposed after the high intertidal, and it gets covered before the high intertidal. Types of things that you find here: mussels, aggregating anemones, and rockweed. Rockweed is this algae right here. Okay, so this picture right here on the right is trying to show you the actual kind of like bands. It's hard on the smartboard. It's more obvious on my computer, but you can see right here, this is actually the high intertidal zone. It's kind of like a lighter color. You see that? Because it's the barnacles, right? The barnacles have a lighter color. Then below that, see how it gets darker? Okay, that's all of the mussels, and then the anemones are down here. Okay, so you have the high intertidal, the middle intertidal. Okay. And then the low intertidal zone, that's the one that's very rarely exposed. That's the one that gets exposed during negative spring tides. That's when you want to go to the tide pools because the zone gets exposed, and so lots of things that normally aren't exposed you can see, okay, which is why we want to go during a negative spring tide, right? And types of animals that you find here, sea stars. Okay, so sea stars, and the bigger green anemones, and then like kelp and surf grass and stuff. And so that's going to be down here. All right. After the low intertidal zone, you have the subtidal zone. That's like considered to be like the edge of the intertidal. Okay, it's always underwater, never gets exposed. You could even say it's like the beginning of the neritic zone, okay, because all of the other habitats that we talk about are underwater all the time. Okay, so it's always underwater. Things that you find here, these are where you find most of the fish, mammals that we've been talking about, right? Lots of the crustaceans and other mollusks and stuff like that. Okay, so, and the big algae like the kelp. Okay, so that's the subtidal zone. So how do we actually maintain these zones in the intertidal, and so that we can go there and actually see them? They're actually maintained by two things. The upper limit of the zone is maintained by physiology, so by how well an animal can deal with the amount of air exposure. So if you're an animal that can deal with more air exposure, you can be found higher in the intertidal zone. Okay, and so you'll find, that's why you find like barnacles higher in the intertidal zone, because they can withstand more air exposure. But after a certain point, if they settle on the rocks, it's too much air exposure, and so they die. So that upper limit of where those barnacles can be found is determined by how much air exposure they can withstand. Does that make sense? The lower limit is determined by biological interactions like competition for space or predation. All right? So, for example, mussels, found in the middle intertidal zone, right? Mussels are really good at competing for space, and they would actually like take over the rest of the intertidal zone if they were allowed to. Okay, so they have their upper limit set by how far out of water they can be for how long, but below that they could just take over. Okay, their lower limit though is set by their predators, sea stars. Okay, so sea stars love mussels, their favorite food. And so sea stars eat the mussels, and they keep the mussels in this middle intertidal zone, okay? Prevent them from taking over down lower in the intertidal zone. And then that upper limit is set by their ability to withstand air exposure. Does that make sense? Okay. And the same kind of thing occurs like with the barnacles. Barnacles are found higher, okay, because they can withstand more air exposure, but they're not found lower because the mussels outcompete them. All right, so that's how you maintain zones. Tide pools kind of mess up that zonation because they hold on to water during low tide and allow for things to be found higher in the intertidal zone than they normally would be. Okay, so we've gone to the tide pools, and 2 of the 5 years we've gone, we've actually found octopus. And like last year, we found a huge octopus. Brian Lee caught like this giant octopus. Well, it's not giant, but it was like this big. It's a big octopus to catch in the intertidal zone. So it was kind of awesome. You can see there's different sizes of tide pools, right? And again, obvious, but if you have a bigger tide pool, more animals can live there. Smaller, fewer. Okay. Yeah, makes sense? All right, so the sea star, the ochre star, is actually a keystone species in the rocky intertidal zone because it keeps mussels in its place, in their place. And it only takes a few sea stars to have a big impact.